A very good evening and welcome to the India Development Debate. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. The question on everyone's mind is, are we truly seeing signs of the worst being behind us? Now, there is a lot of interesting data, high frequency data that points in that direction. But let me talk about what certain companies are saying and consumer facing companies. Most of these companies and FMCG majors have seen production capacities come back to 80 to 90, in some cases 100% of the pre-COVID era. E-commerce seems to be on a boom and is definitely doing better than expected. Latest job data is kind of heartening, where it shows unemployment has gone back to about 8%. That's not great, but still better, though most of it coming from rural India. There are a lot of other companies that are also reporting better than expected recovery. But is that the full picture? Are we looking at the glass half full? And that is the big question we're going to tackle on top of the India Development Debate today. But before we go ahead, let's just give you a look at what the data is telling us.
The growth engine is humming again, and the wheel of consumption is set in motion. The operating capacity of over 15 companies surveyed by ET Now has gone back to pre-COVID levels. The management of these category leaders are optimistic about things looking up from now on. Not just India Inc., even the government is taking heart from the recent data. The Finance Ministry has listed out 14 indicators suggesting that the economic activity is showing green shoots of recovery. Factors like fuel consumption, financial transactions, movement of goods across the country, etc. are all showing that the economy may overcome the COVID-19 shock fairly soon. The Asian Paints management has also added to this colourful picture. Amit Single, the newly inducted Managing Director and CEO, says that a lot of pent-up demand has been released in May and June in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, and it looks like growth is back on track.
We saw a lot of pent-up demand which was coming, and we see that a good demand which was coming from Tier 2, Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities to that extent. The metros and Tier 1 cities were a little slow to respond.
D-Street has rewarded the stock of Page Industries despite that disappointing quarter they had, and mainly because the management has assured investors that the demand post-Unlock 1.0 has exceeded expectations and strong volume growth over the long term is quite possible.
The sales trend has been quite encouraging. At the same time, it is too early to take a call on the demand. But in terms of numbers, if you look at nearly 75% of our retail outlets, we have close to 66,000 multi-brand outlets.
The management over at Britannia claims that it is operating at more than 100% of its capacity, and the months of April and May have witnessed solid volume growth.
So today we are operating at more than 100% capacity. And, while it's important for us to bring a variety back to the market, and we are planning to do it as we speak, but during this period, it was very important to make sure that, we got the bulk of the SKUs of the brands which are most important for consumers to be in the market.
Experts say that while the second quarter of FY20 will show optimistic figures of growth versus the first quarter, which was a washout because of the lockdown imposed to fight the coronavirus, it still remains to be seen how sustainable the growth trajectory will be going ahead. With Dimple Sharma, Vikram Oza, ET Now.
Alright, so a lot of claims, and some of them being made by the Finance Ministry, that released 14 high frequency indicators to say that the worst is behind us. Remember, this has also been the case that the Reserve Bank of India has seen negative territory growth for the rest of the year. So we know that things will be bad in a post-COVID-19 scenario. We don't even know when that post will actually stand. So where do we stand as of today? To speak on this, I'm joined now by Abheek Barua, Chief Economist of HDFC Bank. I'm speaking with Milind Sarwate, founder and CEO of Increate Value Advisors LLP. K. Ramakrishnan, South Asia MD of Kantar, is with us on the show. And I'm also speaking with Vineeta Singh, who's the CEO and co-founder of Sugar Cosmetics. Welcome to all of you, and great to have you on the show today. I just want to get a sense from you first, Mr. K. Ramakrishnan. Are consumers coming back? And obviously in sectors where they first see a priority in spending money. No one is suggesting that people are buying flats or buying large cars right now. But if any of the data in terms of FMCG sales or e-commerce sales is anything to go by, would it be a fair assessment that June has definitely been better and we could be turning a corner?
Yeah, hi. I'm going to talk to you from the purchase perspective, because we track purchase data among consumers and through that build the demand scenario. If you look at the household purchase for FMCG in particular, even before the COVID season, we were not looking at great growths or great times. It was in low single digits, about 3%, 4%, etc. In fact, during the COVID period, from a household purchase perspective, we saw a spike on that, and that is what remains. Now, that will not be the complete picture when it comes to demand of FMCG, because a whole lot of categories of FMCG have a strong percentage of out-of-home consumption or institutional consumption. Now, like let's take foods, for example. If you take atta or if you take coffee or any of those, there is a strong, what they call as HoReCa segment, which is hotels, restaurants, cafes, etc. And there is a lot of purchases from offices and institutions as well. Now, that is the business which kind of came to a grinding halt during the period of COVID. But from a household perspective, we did not see a dip at all. If anything, there was a marginal growth as well. Now, with the unlock happening right now, and with more restaurants opening and more offices coming into place, we are likely to see that growth coming back. And to that extent, if the household is holding on, so we will see a time when FMCG will see a big growth.
Okay, question is, will it be enough, and is it enough to say that these are green shoots? Green shoots is everyone's favorite term, Abheek Barua. No one quite knows what it means. One way of looking at it is that, considering that we've unlocked the economy finally, there's always going to be more consumption than when everything was shut down. So what really is the right indicator to assess whether we're truly turning a corner?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the only way to gauge this would be to kind of look at the counterfactual. What could have happened even if you unlocked, if it were not for this kind of steady recovery? You could have had a situation where supply chains had completely broken down. Companies were reluctant to manufacture and so forth. So compared to an alternative scenario that you can think of, where despite the unlocking, things would have remained kind of flat, and which is the case for sectors like hospitality, hotels, and restaurants haven't picked up despite the unlocking. So compared to an alternative scenario where things would have remained very sedate, this seems to be far more encouraging. But having said that, it's difficult to find something to benchmark this again. So, clearly from the most intensive phase of the lockdown, there would naturally be a recovery if you unlock. But I guess some of the numbers are a little more encouraging than what analysts had kind of penciled in as a consequence of the unlocking, and hence the use of the phrase green shoots. I think some of the numbers that the finance ministry has put out has to be taken, has to be read with a little bit of caution. For instance, they've pointed to a record level of foreign exchange reserves. Now, that is perhaps an unwelcome development, because it tells you that the economy hasn't grown enough, and consequently imports have been very weak. So it's a mixed picture, but I would guess that compared to this alternative scenario, and also compared to what we had factored in terms of the recovery mapping into the unlocking, it's a little more encouraging. That's all I can say.
that's a very hesitant, something is better than nothing kind of outlook. But just to give us a clearer picture, because from here on we need sustainable growth. We need sustainable growth, and the government narrative, as it tends to be, is to look at things, perhaps sometimes prematurely, saying that hey, everything we've done is worked. Because the 14 high frequency indicators put out show a partially rosy picture. It's being credited to the kind of steps and reforms that the government has taken. Would that be fair to say, Milind Sarwate? And do you see some kind of a lag before consumer demand kind of roars back? It's been very patchy right now. So, for example, some kind of an insatiable demand for biscuits. But what about restaurants? What about movies? What about the service sector? The service sector itself seems to be in a bad shape.
I think you're absolutely right, Tamanna. There has to be a lag simply because there are physical restrictions as to when consumption can begin in full steam. As you rightly observed, there are places of public consumption. And I think Ramakrishnan also mentioned about that. Out of home consumption may not have resumed fully. There are still health concerns. There are still hygiene concerns, and it will take some time before that resumption occurs. And you mentioned about biscuits. So I feel, in fact, while the overall demand for consumer products would have remained the same or may have gone down to some extent, there is a demand for certain categories which are largely at-home consumption and less complicated items, which has gone up dramatically. So there are various cuts of consumption that have shown some kind of a change. For example, between staples and high-end products, staples have grown hugely. And you will see that in companies like Britannia, where they are showing a huge growth in this Q1 of this financial year. Britannia has grown, I would say, maybe dramatically, maybe they'll grow more than 20%. And there are other companies which are focusing on necessities, so to say, which have also grown very largely, somewhat unexpectedly, one would say. So I think it's a resetting of priorities at the consumer end, partly because of lack of availability, because of inability to go out, and also to some extent because of income considerations. Current income may have got stalled in some cases, and the expectations of future income have definitely gone down. There is a lot of uncertainty at the micro level. Macro data sometimes can be very exciting, but at the micro level, there is a lot of people who are uncertain about their future income. They may not have lost the job. So unemployment numbers are also not necessarily a great indicator. I feel FMCG or consumer product consumption is led hugely by a feel-good factor, by the expectation that you are going to continue to do well, and therefore you should keep upgrading and getting into better and better products. I think that feeling has suffered. And therefore, I feel at the overall level, the sector is unlikely to show a great growth. Within the sector, there will be a lot of cuts where there will be changes. As I mentioned about staples versus luxuries, or urban versus rural, and so on. There will be so many cuts, and we can discuss it today if time permits.
Yes. Yes, no, absolutely. The urban versus rural story is in fact a very interesting one. But I want to get a perspective from someone who, in a sense, has skin in the game. Vineeta Singh, what have you seen? You're in the business of cosmetics, a highly discretionary spend, a highly discretionary item. Now, a player like Nykaa has said that they've seen an improvement month on month and hope to get back to pre-COVID levels by July. Are you seeing that kind of an optimism?
Right. So yes, like Milind mentioned, there is definitely a reprioritization. Now, what has resulted from that is not, the spend that people have reduced in, say, going out, eating out, travel. Some of it has impacted their feel-good spend actually going up. So small ticket items, which primarily includes cosmetics and some of the fashion products as well, there we are not seeing any dearth of consumer demand. In fact, the average order value, like when one customer comes and shops, what she buys in an order has almost gone up about 40 to 50%. So although business is not yet back to the pre-COVID levels because of some operational issues, like for instance, in malls, a lot of shops are still shut because the retailers and the malls haven't been able to agree on a rent waiver. So that's leading to malls still being at only about 20 to 30% of the pre-COVID levels. But for a single customer who's going into say a general trade store or an outlet that's open or online, the per e-commerce part of business, we're actually back to pre-COVID levels, which for us was double of last June, and the spends are much lesser. So e-commerce is of course bounced back really well. Retail still back to only about 30 to 40%, but I think that is a lot to do with the operational challenges of us not being able to keep the stores open than consumers. And I know it sounds very rational that somebody is actually going out and shopping cosmetics in this time, but I think retail has this really powerful therapeutic value, especially for women, and I think that's what's getting them back to stores, and at least in the small tickets items we're not seeing them really struggle.
That's a very interesting perspective, Vineeta, especially when you talk about feel-good purchases, because the whole pent-up demand theory is, seeing different facets to us. Give us some more insight. What are the kind of items that you see more people, sort of picking up? What are the trends that you're noticing?
So there's definitely a small shift from say color cosmetics to skincare products. People want to take better care of their skin. There's a whole trend of maskne where you wear a mask and that's resulting in some acne. So people want to treat those problems more. There's also more spend on eye products than lips. But overall, the shift that was there in May, where it was like much more skincare than color cosmetics, June is actually quite close. It's only about 5 to 7% off in terms of the split. And, we're thinking that consumers are actually back to buying those products that they used to buy pre-COVID because they're actually getting ready to go out. They're in this zone where they're thinking that, this is probably behind me. I don't know if there's going to be a lockdown again, but at least customers are now like sick of 3 months of lockdown. So they want to get out and they're already prepping for that, which is why Myntra also saw fashion apparel purchase of 40 lakh orders in 3 days in their end of season sale, which was like phenomenal numbers for a category like apparel, which you actually purchase for going out. So I think it's also an anticipational purchase. Again, within that, there's shopping more of like t-shirts and athleisure, which is rather than formals. So some shifts are there, but I don't think it's very significant yet for small ticket items. The behavior hasn't very significantly changed.
A very interesting aspect there. Milind, how do you look at this? Depending on what category and what product, we're definitely going to see some return of demand. Do you think it's going to be enough to push the envelope and move towards any kind of significant tangible recovery?
I think there will be a return to demand because by definition, consumer products are things that do not dip so much in a downturn. But I think there are some factors which put a limit on what consumption is possible and where and when. I think there are still a lot of physical restrictions, and there will be a reluctance to go into malls and shopping centers and so on, and that will limit consumption to some extent. And as Vineeta rightly pointed out, e-commerce and things getting directly delivered to your house, do-it-yourself kits, those consumption items will go up. Again, as I said, at the macro level, at the aggregate level, there may not be a big uptick in consumer demand, but within that, there is likely to be a lot of shift. And as again, Vineeta mentioned, amongst color cosmetics, after a while, after maybe 6 weeks of lockdown, people started realizing that maybe hair colors is a necessity after all. It's not a luxury. So people would then try and find ways of consuming it at home, although hair salons are not really working in a large way at all. So that kind of a shift is likely to happen.
Yeah.
Some categories will receive a boost, and some categories will have to fall. I think categories which have a direct pull with the consumer, as opposed to categories which are typically pushed by the trade and by the wholesaler, the pull categories will gain a lot, because you will also find that classical ways of demand creation have also been absent. Of course, media is returning slowly to the consumer sector, but the advertising onslaught that you usually see, it is not there, nor are there major events like IPL for people to hammer their brands at the consumers. So core consumer pool will really need a lot of focus on that. And I think
No, I mean
again,
they're keen on IPL.
yes, but
Yeah,
it will not
we'll have to
happen. It will not
we'll have
happen
to
right
wait and
now.
see on what happens with IPL because they're keen on pushing it. They're very high stakes.
I,
Yeah.
IPL actually
No,
is
and might happen
a
without audiences, etc. We'll have to
it's
wait and
it's an
see.
economic event. It's an economic event as compared to being a cricket event increasingly. So a large part of income redistribution
True,
happens during IPL.
true,
So
true, true. I want to, I want to, I want to I want to just sort of broaden the scope of this and move beyond your high frequency high ticket consumer sort of products. Abhi, I want to understand the impact of the rural push and something we saw in the CMI employment numbers. The urban employment numbers still bad, but the rural employment improving, and there has been this huge mass migration. We still don't know what the impact of that is going to be. How do you see that aspect panning out in terms of economic recovery and demand?
I think that is going to be the big driver for an economic recovery, to the extent that some recovery will pan out, because that has been relatively untouched by the virus. We have seen fabulous numbers both for procurement of the previous season, the Rabi harvest, and very good sowing numbers for Kharif. So that seems to be insulated and doing extremely well. One of the indicators that the finance minister released was the fertilizer sales data, which was a whopping around 100% up over the previous year's levels, which is very encouraging. So I think if there is a pocket of hope in the economy, it is really the agricultural sector with a spillover to the broader rural economy. And to the extent that consumer big ticket discretionary items are an indicator of a possible return of consumer confidence, a bellwether of where the economy is headed, I think we are getting anecdotal evidence that there is considerable traction in the demand for things like two-wheelers, cars, which are models which are principally sold in the rural market. And this is backed by a demand for retail credit for these items. So I think that's a pocket we can be reasonably sure of as a support to the economy. How much it's going to push is anybody's guess, but I suspect it will prevent the economy from staying in a sort of a low level equilibrium mode for too long. And it could sort of, once the initial rural demand comes in, there is an impact on urban incomes and so forth, as we have seen, and that's going to push things forward. The other thing, which is not entirely sort of consistent with the unemployment numbers for the urban areas that you provided, total evidence going around, which gives, for instance, banks the confidence to give retail credit, is that the kind of job losses or salary cuts have not been as severe as was anticipated. And again, I sort of go back to the issue that I raised initially, that you have to sort of compare this with the kind of numbers that are coming out, or the anecdotal evidence, with what was anticipated a couple of months ago. It's certainly better than what was factored in, expected, anticipated at the end of March or early April. So from that perspective, there is good news. But not every indicator that is being touted unambiguously points to a dramatic recovery. So we'll have to sort of read these indicators cautiously, but I think there is reason to be somewhat optimistic with a huge bet on the rural story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we'd be happy to be optimistic. I think optimism is something we need, but it needs to be backed by actual, data and facts. And you've put that very well, the nuance that we need to understand there, Abheek. I want to understand from you, Mr. Ramakrishnan, that where is this rural push going to come from, and how do you think that's going to impact spending? Is it also going to change spending patterns?
So actually, from a grocery FMCG perspective, rural sensitivity is actually less than even urban sensitivity, uh, subject to certain conditions like, let's say, a monsoon or a harvest. These are two things which kind of drive it hard. And when it comes to COVID, the sensitivity that we saw in rural was actually lesser than what we saw in urban. But behavior was perhaps similar, for people buying larger packs when required because of limited movement and things like that. But one of the things that needs to be noticed is that there was a kind of delay in ability to move the harvest to the markets on account of the lockdown. So therefore, that delay would have caused a little bit of delay in liquidity, and therefore that money will come into the market now, and therefore that spend will get pushed at the moment, we would say.
All right. No, just to follow up on that, Ramakrishnan, what are the kind of sectors and areas where you expect a better spend? I mean, apart from the obvious ones, do you think that the FMCG sort of improvement will continue? It's sustainable, and is most of the growth going to be focused in the e-commerce space?
Yeah, so from an FMCG stroke grocery perspective, I think the role that e-commerce plays in its growth is not substantial. I mean, it's in single digits and so on. Yes, there was a significant growth during the lockdown phase, but it still is not enough to move the needle purely from e-commerce in an FMCG perspective. But within FMCG, if you see, has there been, we earlier spoke about, some of the other speakers also spoke about rationalization, reprioritization, and so on. If you look at every big city that we're talking about, we are looking at consumers reducing the number of categories that enter their basket. Like if you look at a city like Mumbai, which is perhaps the worst lockdown and for the longest period perhaps, the number of categories is almost n-5, which means 5 categories are lesser. So what can these 5 categories be? Obviously, staples cannot be reduced because people continue to buy their atta, maida, their salt, and so on and so forth. Hygiene has seen a huge boom. I mean, like just to give you a bunch of numbers, you can look at sanitizers. Sanitizers in 2019 had an annual penetration of 1.5%, which means 1.5% of the total households bought even once a year in 2019. Today, there's a monthly penetration of 11%. Now, that is a multiplication. So hygiene categories like hand sanitizers and similarly hand wash, all of these categories are seeing a lot of boom. And again, hygiene continued on, let's say, floor cleaners, toilet bathroom cleaners. These are all categories which are seeing some growth across branded and unbranded variants as well. However, what is getting compromised in this whole basket is what we see as slightly more discretionary in nature, which is just slightly contrary to what we've heard from some of the others. Grooming categories have seen a little bit of a suffering. What I mean by that is, let's say, a hair oil has seen to be hit and has seen to be removed from the basket of consumers. So it is a bunch. Will health and hygiene continue to dominate? Yes, definitely they'll continue to dominate. However, how much of a unlocking happens, there is going to be that fine element of fear in people's minds, and so therefore the higher need for sanitation or the higher need for washing and all of those things will remain.
Yeah.
Definitely, we will see a comeback when it comes to these discretionary products, but how fast definitely remains to be seen. It has not yet been seen in the overall purchase scheme of things.
Vineeta, what is the kind of outlook you're looking at? I mean, you described a feel-good factor, maybe some of it fueled by a pent-up demand. Surely that will not sustain over time. Has this whole scenario changed your projections internally, and how soon do you need the retail part of it to open up to actually forge ahead?
Right. So, of course, one disclaimer that, we're a younger brand, so we've been like growing like 3x, 2x over the last couple of years. So like our original projection was, of course, to double this year. And that's not happening. But we're still not looking at, a year of degrowth. We're still looking at 20-25% increase. There will be some shifts. Like for instance, already we're seeing like tier 2 as a percentage has gone up in the last 2 months, probably because metros have suffered more. Now we don't know whether that'll come back. So there are, and then within categories, there's a shift in the mix of products. But overall, for us, luckily, as a category, the peak season comes September to Feb, and anyways, as all the companies in the beauty category do almost 70-80% of their annual sales during these months, because it's also like it starts with Karwa Chauth and then ends with Valentine's Day, or Women's Day rather. So very luckily for us, we're still expecting September, which is September, October, which is when the season starts, to be much stronger months in terms of the lockdowns being much the restrictions being much lesser. So if that still brings us to 70-80%, and we've managed to come back to almost 50-60% of the company's overall net revenue in June itself, we do think that we have a shot at least a 20-30% growth over last year.
All right, optimism is what we could do with at this point, but take all of that data and all of that green shoots revival with a pinch of salt. We're just about perhaps seeing some good news. Let it sustain, let it grow, and let's hope that we forge ahead without any more setbacks. I want to thank all of you for joining us on the first big discussion this evening on the India Development Debate.